So I guess I wanted to go through why borrowing may make sense. And in this case, it seemed fairly obvious that one of the things they could look at would be purchasing their own business premises off the current landlord. So if they go and establish a self-managed super fund, they can roll each of their super funds, their AMP or their MLC type supers, roll them into the self-managed super fund to start it off with $250,000 in the bank account of the super fund. And I guess for any of you that might have a company or a trust already, it just works in a very similar way. We're just under the SIS legislation, so all the assets have to be owned in the name of the super fund. They then go and make an offer to the landlord to purchase that property for $435,000, which was just based on the yield at around 8% on a commercial property. The landlord accepts the offer, so he's going to sell the property to them, and they're going to go and borrow $260,000 under the limited recourse borrowing rules, which is a 60% value of the property. So they're under that 65% loan to value ratio. Out of the $250,000 cash they started with from their other super being rolled in, they're going to use about $198,000 of it, which will be the deposit on the property, the stamp duty of around $13,000, and the other costs of about $10,000. Now, we'll just say with this, the costs involved in doing borrowing through a super fund are more expensive than doing it in a trust or a company or your own name, and that's because the whole arrangement has to comply with the SIS legislation. So you have to make sure if you're doing this that obviously it's on a really decent property. Now, if we just went and applied, so if we go and do all that, the super fund has to deal with you on an arm's length basis. So because the super fund now owns that, they can't stop paying rent. They have to still pay rent to the super fund on an arm's length basis. So the super fund's then collecting that rent off them, and it can then use the rent to repay the borrowing. And in this case, the rent would clear that loan in about 14.5 years, working on a 9% interest rate. Now, we know before that they were paying the rent and they were doing their $25,000 each super contributions every year. So if they're still putting those contributions in, the rent plus the contributions, net of tax and other costs, would allow about $70,000 a year spare to be used to pay that loan out in about 4.5 years. So that's a pretty spectacular outcome, because they're only about 44.5 years old at that stage. They now own a completely debt-free property in their super fund, and all of that rent is coming in, that $34,800 rent is coming into the super fund every year on top of their contribution. So now they're not just limited to $25,000 a year each going into the fund. And if we go back and think about our tax rates, and that the super fund is a tax structure, then all of that income coming into the super fund is only being taxed at 15%. Okay, so it's kind of why wouldn't you want to do that? So if I just show you how it would all look, we've got our super fund that then owns our business premises. Because it's a self-managed fund, as I said before, it must deal on arm's length terms, so they would have to put an arm's length lease in place between the super fund and their company. And the company would then pay the rent across to the super fund, and the rent is still going to be deductible to the company as it normally would be, and is then coming across into the super fund. And as I said before, it's then only being taxed at 15% within the super fund. The really fantastic thing with this strategy, though, is that the minute these people get to age 60 and they start a pension from their super fund, the rent is being collected in here completely tax-free and can then be drawn out as a tax-free income in retirement. So that works fantastically. So is everyone okay with how that strategy is working? Yep. And if we look at the long-term wealth creation that this can actually do for you, it makes a huge difference. So I use really conservative assumptions when I calculated the numbers on this particular case study, and I just said maybe the property can get 2% per annum growth, that we were getting our 8% yield on the rent, and that the rental income might be able to be increased by 2% per annum every year. Any surplus income would be getting collected in a bank account at 6% per annum, and as I said before, the interest while that was there on the loan would be at 9%. And I've assumed that their contributions of $25,000 a year each keep going into the fund. So by the time these people are age 60, from a start of $250,000 in super, they would have $3.6 million in their super fund based on those conservative assumptions. Now, if they hadn't put the property in there and were just getting about a 6% average return on their super fund and just constrained to only the $25,000 a year contributions going in there, then they would have ended up with $2.9 million over the same period. So that property has made a fairly significant difference over that 20-year period. And I think particularly for people that are under age 50, where you're going to get stuck only being able to contribute $25,000 a year, that is a fantastic way to be able to collect more into super.